This was once someone's home. Now it is abandoned, along with all it contains. The people who lived here were not the victims of plague, war, or famine. They were forced to flee by the worst nuclear accident in history, at Chernobyl, in the Ukraine. On the 28th of April, 1986, the Soviet people were told, an accident has occurred at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. One of the reactors was damaged. Measures are being taken to eliminate the consequences of the accident. Behind these bland words lay a catastrophe which threatened to realize the worst nuclear nightmare. A reactor running out of control and on the brink of meltdown.
We are approaching the block.
This is all that was left of Chernobyl's number 4 reactor after it had been ripped apart by a series of massive explosions on Saturday, the 26th of April. As the helicopter hovered over the smouldering ruins, the cameraman aboard filmed the very face of hell itself.
Higher, higher, higher. Right, hold it at that. Hold it where the smoke is. Hold it there.
Below him, and still glowing a baleful red, were the remains of the reactor's overheated graphite core. How had the Chernobyl disaster been allowed to happen? And what are its consequences today? Chernobyl was not the first occasion on which the world stared a full-blown nuclear disaster in the face. In March 1979, there was a serious accident at the 3 Mile Island power station in Pennsylvania. 3 Mile Island was a commercial plant owned by the Metropolitan Edison Company. A combination of systems failure and human error had led to the buildup of a huge hydrogen bubble in the upper part of the number 3 reactor vessel. It threatened to explode, releasing massive amounts of radioactive material into the atmosphere. As scientists strove to reduce the size of the bubble, the US government sought to reassure the public, which was told there was little or no danger of radiation in the area of 3 Mile Island. The local population was not reassured. Inside 48 hours, nearly half of the 200,000 people living within 21 miles of the plant had left their homes. People refused to believe that nothing terrible had happened. The governor of Pennsylvania ordered the evacuation of all pregnant women and children of preschool age within a radius of 5 miles of the plant. He also recommended that everyone living within a radius of 10 miles of 3 Mile Island should stay indoors. On the 1st of April, President Jimmy Carter and his wife Rosalind visited 3 Mile Island. He appealed for everyone to follow all instructions calmly and without question, should the need arise. The swelling bubble was contained and then removed. The crisis passed. The plant was shut down and $40 million was spent on cleaning up the intense radioactivity which had accumulated beneath the containment. Critics of nuclear power accused Metropolitan Edison of rushing to bring the reactor online too fast to save a big tax bill. Government inspectors had given the go-ahead for the commercial operation of the plant in spite of numerous mechanical failures which had forced a series of shutdowns. False economies, lax regulation, and human error had brought the plant to the brink of disaster. Things were no better in the Soviet Union. The suppression of any reporting of a long series of serious nuclear accidents dating back to 1957 created a climate of complacency in which Soviet nuclear power became a completely accident-free zone. Soviet reactors were supposed to be as safe as samovars. In reality, they were far more sloppily run than their American counterparts. The Soviet public did not know this. Their political masters told them, "Nuclear power stations are like stars that shine all day long. We shall sow them all over the land." They were sowing the seeds of destruction. Equipped with 4 1,000-megawatt reactors built around a central chimney, Chernobyl was one of the oldest of the Soviet Union's civilian nuclear stations. Situated 70 miles north of the ancient city of Kiev, the capital of the Ukraine, it employed 5,000 people. It was not an accident-free zone. In September 1982, errors by operational staff resulted in the destruction of the central fuel assembly in the number 1 reactor. Radioactivity was released into the plant and the nearby town of Pripyat, which housed the plant's workforce. In another incident, staff doing repair work were exposed to severe radiation while eliminating what the plant's engineers considered a minor irregularity. In this culture of complacency, Chernobyl was operating only a step away from a major accident. Something had to give. The number 4 reactor at Chernobyl came online in 1983. A 12-foot-thick concrete disc separated the core of the reactor from the refueling unit above. The main part of the core, the so-called moderator, was a large graphite block into which the uranium fuel rods were inserted. The reaction heated water pipes alongside, producing the steam which powered the station's turbines to generate electricity. On Friday, the 25th of April 1986, the operators on number 4 reactor began to reduce its power in preparation for a test to measure the amount of residual energy produced by the turbine and generator after the nuclear reactor had been shut down. But the reactor would not be shut down for the test, only isolated. What was shut down was the entire emergency safety system, so that this would not automatically abort the test. The first step was to cut off the steam line to the turbine. The residual energy would be measured until the turbine stopped. Simultaneously, the power in the reactor was reduced to less than 10% of its capacity. Its emergency core cooling, power regulation, and automatic shutdown systems were closed down. At this stage, the technicians were operating in the dark. Computer printouts would soon indicate that the reactor was overheating, but the technicians pressed on. To raise the power, the control rods were withdrawn, causing the temperature in the reactor to rise and dangerous gases to build up. The power level reached a point at which, in normal circumstances, the emergency system would have shut the reactor down, but the emergency system had been switched off. The operators were fast approaching the point of no return. When the operators attempted to reinsert the control rods, they sparked a massive power surge. Fires broke out. When burning fuel met cooling water, it triggered 3 massive explosions which ripped off the roof of the reactor. A huge fireball burst through the roof of the reactor building. Red-hot shards of graphite and nuclear fuel cascaded onto the tar-coated roof of the turbine hall, setting it ablaze. The control room was hit by a gigantic shock wave, carrying with it a cloud of milk-white radioactive dust which covered everyone there. Into the atmosphere spewed nearly 50 tons of evaporated nuclear fuel. Another 70 tons of fuel and 700 tons of radioactive graphite were scattered around the plant. mingling with the debris surrounding the site of the blast. Everyone in the area of the plant felt the peculiar sensation of massively irradiated air, thick and pulsating, which started a sinister, dry prickling in their throats. The reactor was now a gigantic nuclear volcano. The other 3 reactors were shut down while the fire continued to rage. It would burn for 8 days. No attempt was made to organize the immediate evacuation of the population of the nearby town of Pripyat, which housed Chernobyl's workforce. 36 hours passed before its 40,000 inhabitants were borne away in a fleet of buses. To minimize panic, there were no rallying points. In just under 2.5 hours, Pripyat became a ghost town. Second World War gas masks, portraits of Lenin, the toys in a children's nursery, all were abandoned in a pathetic jumble. The ripple effect of the blast was now spreading outward. The countryside around Pripyat consists of thinly populated wooded steppes, small villages and farms. Between Pripyat and Chernobyl lay the Kiev Reservoir, fed by the Pripyat River. In the hours after the explosion, a deadly radioactive downpour was falling on the countryside and the reservoir, which supplied water to the 2.5 million inhabitants of Kiev, Russia's 3rd largest city. Radio hams across the world were picking up alarming reports of the size of the blast and the scale of the casualties. Monitoring stations in Sweden were the first to detect excessively high levels of xenon and krypton. The Swedes took their own measures. They also demanded that the Soviets comply with international regulations and come clean about what had happened at Chernobyl. The Russian ambassador in London was at pains to play down the incident.
About the reports over here, Ambassador, that several thousand people have been killed in the accident. That's not true.
On the day of the blast, the heavier products of radiation spread west to cover much of Poland. By day 3, the fallout had spread across a huge swathe of the Western Soviet Union and was menacing Western Europe. The following day, Scandinavia and Germany were affected. And within 10 days, the cloud covered most of Europe. By Wednesday, the 30th of April, European governments were taking steps to protect their people's health. Sweden banned the import of fresh meat, fish and vegetables from the Soviet bloc countries. High levels of radioactivity were being measured far afield. In Ayrshire, in Scotland, a warning siren at the Hunterstown nuclear power station was triggered by a high level of radioactivity. In Norway and Finland, the fallout threatened the future of the reindeer herds. In Poland and in the Kiev region, iodine was given to children and pregnant mothers to protect the thyroid gland against iodine-131, an element in the fallout which was quickly absorbed by the body and associated with cancer and genetic disease. At Chernobyl, radiation levels within the buildings around No. 4 reactor were too high to allow human beings, even those in protective gear, to enter them. To control the fire, civil defense forces began to drop bags of wet sand, lead and boron carbide over the gaping hole in the reactor. On their bombing runs, the helicopter pilots had to hover over the reactor for up to 4 minutes, absorbing massive doses of radiation. Many of them were taken ill in the air. But this supremely dangerous operation carried on. At this stage, there was no alternative. These were the frontline troops in a nightmarish twist on the notion of nuclear war. Construction equipment and materials were rushed into the disaster zone. Red Army chemical warfare units rolled in. These men were part of a colossal containment exercise which had to be improvised on the spot. Few of the tens of thousands of workers involved, many of them volunteers, had anything but the most basic inkling of the risks they were running as they went into action. But they were heroes nonetheless. The clear-up teams dropped on the remaining reactors' roofs could work only in short, self-timed bursts. Any longer in this poisoned environment would spell certain death. The scene resembled something from a science fiction movie. The clock in the corner of the picture records the seconds the emergency teams could endure before evacuation. Russian audiences watched these remarkable pictures live. Whether these heroic efforts served any clear purpose remains open to question. Certainly some lives were needlessly sacrificed in the first, frantic phase of the containment and clean-up operation. While robot vehicles worked to clear up the irradiated mess, the threat of another explosion remained if the reactor core penetrated the concrete floor and came into contact with the water below. Engineers cut their way into the reactor building with a welder's arc and then fed liquid nitrogen through a pipe to reduce the temperature below the reactor. On the evening of the 9th of May, some of the remaining graphite in the reactor burned through, forming a cavity under the material dumped in the reactor by the helicopters. An irradiated mass of 5,000 tons of sand, clay, and boron carbide collapsed, releasing a huge cloud of nuclear dust. It settled on the dead town of Pripyat and the surrounding countryside. The possibility of meltdown remained, and the Soviets now began to tunnel under the reactor. Miners from the Donbass worked in conditions little different from gold rush days. They swigged from bottles of vodka to keep going. The cleanup lurched forward. Drivers absorbed huge amounts of radiation from their own vehicles. The miners tunneling beneath the reactor worked round the clock. In Pripyat, the contamination was hosed away. Bulldozer drivers, protected by lead shields, got to grips with thousands of tons of irradiated earth and debris. Now the blast was claiming its early victims. There was nothing that the most advanced treatments and medicine could do for those who had been most severely irradiated. Meanwhile, up to 1 million citizens of Kiev were taking no chances. They had left the city in the week following the disaster, storming the extra trains laid on by the authorities and even clinging to the roofs and steps. Black marketeers charged extortionate prices for rail tickets. Some found alternative means of transport. Those who stayed were told to keep their windows closed, mop floors at regular intervals, and frequently wash their hair to avoid contamination. Schools were closed and their pupils evacuated. On the day the schools closed, the radioactive cloud returned to Kiev. Radiation levels rose to over 300 times the World Health Organization norm. At Chernobyl, engineers were planning to encase the still smoldering wreck of the reactor in a colossal 20-story-high concrete sarcophagus. The sarcophagus at Chernobyl is like a gigantic sticking plaster, slapped on a gaping wound. It covers the source of the disaster, but cannot hide or prevent the long-term consequences. The destruction of No. 4 reactor produced an army of ecological refugees. Almost 400,000 people were forced to leave their homes in the wake of the Chernobyl blast. Those from the 30-kilometer zone will never return. For the elderly, the clock stopped on the 26th of April, 1986. A few have filtered back. They have lived here all their lives. They didn't leave in the war, and they won't leave now. Three million children now live in a heavily contaminated zone the size of England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. There's been a significant increase in health disorders among the children in the contaminated areas. But the worst may be yet to come. The major cost of the Chernobyl disaster, rehousing refugees, lost agricultural production, and the medical monitoring and treatment of people in the contaminated areas, is now borne by the independent states of Ukraine and Belarus. It is a task beyond their limited resources. The rescue workers are rightly proud of their efforts at Chernobyl, but the effects of that terrible April night in 1986 will be felt by generations as yet unborn. In the aftermath of the disaster, the Soviet authorities were quick to pin the blame on the senior management at Chernobyl, several of whom were subsequently sentenced to hard labor. The area around Chernobyl is now a vast laboratory, where the effects of radiation on flora and fauna are studied in minute detail. The underlying reasons for the catastrophe went to the heart of the Soviet system, where a culture of secrecy and corruption fatally lowered standards at a plant which Western experts deemed inherently unsafe. Even so, no one could have predicted that a routine test would be conducted in No. 4 reactor in such a way as to ensure its destruction. Even the safest systems can be undermined by human error. Today, the plant at Chernobyl is still producing electricity. but the sarcophagus surrounding the remains of number 4 reactor has a life expectancy of only 25 years. Its contents will remain deadly for another 200.